I told you that I was able to get Linux to run on this NAS, and now I'm going to show you how to do it. We're going to need some hardware first. We need a USB hub. We need a media card reader, a USB media card reader with a card, or a big USB thumb drive. I just happen to have some SD cards lying around, so it was easier to use the readers with the SD cards. You can use whatever suits your fancy. You just need one big enough to hold the ISO for your Linux installer. In this case, I'm using Ubuntu, which is about 700 megs, I think. Yeah, 683 megs. So, something bigger than that. And then a drive that's big enough to hold the installation. That one's a 64 gigabyte, but I think you can get away with just a couple if you really had to. There's no hard drives in the unit. We're just going to be running straight from the USB drive. This would be a setup if you wanted to just use it as a firewall or something like that. You can put drives in it though, and they are detectable. So if you wanted to use Samba, you could share files out with that, or one of the media servers, any Linux application. Because once it's done, you can treat it just like any other Ubuntu server install. We're going to be installing Ubuntu Server version 16. The way we're going to do that is using this program called Rufus. And what this lets you do is burn an ISO image, well, not burn, but copy an ISO image to a USB drive, and then makes it bootable. So you can boot it off straight from USB instead of trying to plug a USB CD-ROM drive into this, which I did try and I could not get to work. So this may be your only real way of doing this. You've got your standard options, GPT, EFI. If you don't know what you're doing, just accept the defaults. It seems to work whether or not I use EFI or not, and whether or not I use MBR, they all seem to work. You click Start, and it'll write out to your USB device. When it's done, we're going to plug it into our reader, which we've got here, which is plugged into our USB hub. We need the hub because there's only 2 USB ports on the NAS itself, and we need a USB port for the source, we need one for the destination, and we need one for the keyboard. And I'll show you why we need a keyboard here in just a minute. So the reason this works is this NAS is really just a small little computer. It's running an Atom processor with 2 gigs of RAM. So it is 64-bit compatible, but is otherwise x86 compatible. We are installing 64-bit Ubuntu on it. I'm sure 32-bit would probably work. I just happen to be doing the 64-bit version. So the issue with this is we don't have a monitor to see the output, a screen output, so we can't see the installer to run the installer process. What I was able to figure out is if I can get it to boot, which I am able to get it to boot, off that USB drive, you can actually use a keyboard and run through all the commands because the installer's running. You're just not seeing what's happening. So to guide me through it, I've actually set up a virtual machine. This is running in Hyper-V. You could do this in VirtualBox, VMware, your hypervisor of choice. I just happen to have a Hyper-V box handy here. So what we're going to do is run through the installer here, and then we're just going to we're going to enter the same keyboard commands at the same time on both keyboards, so that we're stepping through the process on here even though we can't see what's actually happening. So here's our Ubuntu Hyper-V setup here. And this will be the first menu that you're going to see when you boot off the CD. So now we have it up here. We can leave it here until we get the NAS to the same point. And to do that, we've got our USB hub hooked up to it with the SD card reader that has an activity light on it. That's actually going to be really important because we want to see when there's disk activity. If we don't have that, then we have no idea if the menus that we're choosing are actually loading or anything's actually happening. So if you have these little LEDs on the readers, that's going to make your life a lot easier. So to bring it up to this point, we're going to turn on the NAS and hold the recovery button on the back. This is the same process you'd go through if you were doing a factory restore of the system. But instead of loading the Western Digital software, we're actually booting off the Ubuntu ISO. So to do that, we hold the little button on the back and turn it on. says startup initializing. And then you just keep holding that button until eventually it will say that it failed to start. Okay, so now we're at the point where it says the startup has failed. The key here, though, is it hasn't actually failed. Right now, it should be sitting at the boot menu off of our little USB drive here. So if we hit enter on the keyboard connected to it, we can see we get activity, which means it's now booting off the CD, or the ISO at least. So that's good, that means it worked. So now we need to bring our virtual machine up to the same point. So we're going to hit enter to start the installer. And then at the first menu here, we need to change what's called the debconf priority. That will give us more options during the installer so that we can get the SSH server up. Once we have SSH running, we can get into it and then run the command somewhat graphically over something like PuTTY or SSH from another Linux server or Linux box if you had one. So we're going to hit escape and escape. So basically anything we do on this keyboard, we have to do on this keyboard identically. So now we're going to go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and hit enter. That's our debconf priority. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Enter. And then we're going to change the priority to low, which is 2 down, enter. 2 down, enter. Then we need to do the load installer components from CD. But before we do that, we're going to plug our USB drive that we're installing to in. We don't have it plugged in when we start the process, that way this thing doesn't try to boot off of here. But now it's fine to plug it in because we're going to need it to be detected. Let that settle down. Okay, so now we need to do the load installer components from CD, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, enter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, enter. And we can see we get activity again, which means it's reading from that drive. We do want to load our USB storage driver. Right now we can see it's detecting the CD drive on it. And this is where it's important to have these little LEDs on there. That way you can tell what it's doing. If you're hitting enter a few times and you're not getting any activity, that means it's not reading anything and you've probably lost your place. And you'll have to start from scratch. Or good luck figuring out where you were at. So it should have said that it detected a CD drive. Enter. And then the option that we want is this network console. That will start the SSH server and let us connect to it from another computer. So we're going to go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Hit space. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Hit space. We hit enter and enter. And we can see it's reading again, it's doing its thing. And I think it's worth pointing out at this point that this is just running an Atom and we're running over USB 2. So every time that you get through these steps, make sure that the blinking has stopped on all your devices, because your computer is going to be way quicker than this thing is going to be. And if you try doing commands before it's done loading here, you're going to lose your place. And then you'll have to start from scratch, and that's no bueno. Okay, now that everything seems to be loaded from the drive, we want to change our debconf priority back. This way it'll go through the regular installer steps. So we're going to go back down to change debconf priority, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Enter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Enter. And then we're going to set it back to high, which is up 2. So now it's going to ask us about our network interfaces. We need the network hooked up to it so that we'll be able to SSH into it. If you don't know what SSH is, it's a secure shell. It lets you connect to a Linux or Unix system and gives you a nice command line interface. You can run the system just like you were sitting in front of it. On the back of the NAS, if you use the port closest to the USB ports, the network port closest to the USB ports, that'll be F0. So we're going to select that. And now it's going to go through and try to pull a DHCP address. Alright, so now that the network configuration is done, we need to check our DHCP table. Now, hopefully you're running a nice router of some sort that will show you the DHCP leases that you've got on your network. If not, you're going to be guessing at addresses since you can't see what the thing got. So if I refresh my leases here, I know that this 42 address, this MAC address, is the NIC in here. An easy way to tell which it is on the back of the board here. It actually has the MAC address of both NICs printed on it. So you can match this up with your DHCP list. So we can see, according to this, it should have an IP address of 192.168.50.181. If we ping that, we should get a response. Yep. And there it is. So it is alive. So now we're going to answer a few other questions. What's going to be its host name? Ubuntu is going to be fine for both of them. And now it's going to ask our SSH password. This isn't going to be the system password. This is just the one to finish the installation. It should be a good one, otherwise it'll complain that it's not complex enough. So make sure you use a complex password, because if you lose your place and have to try and guess the password or what part of the password prompt you're on, you're going to be lost. So we're going to set it to a password that I know is good. So we got to put the password in twice and hit enter. And it tells us that the installer can be reached at whatever its IP address is. Now this is the one for our VM, which is 171. Ours is 181. So now we put the password in over here. Enter. And it's telling us what our SSH key is. If this matters to you, great. For most people, it won't. So we're going to hit enter and enter. So with that done, we should be able to get an SSH connection up. So if we put in that IP and try to connect to it, we get it. And we're saying, hey, this is a new SSH key because this is that key is generated every time the SSH server starts. So we're going to say yes. The username is installer, I believe. And then the password that we set. Yep. So now that we're in, we have an SSH session. And we can do the entire rest of our installation from here, just like you would if you were sitting in front of it. So now you don't have to do anything blind. So at this point, we're basically successful. You can treat it just like a regular old Ubuntu install. So we can go through the installer, English, United States, change your keyboard layout, no, English is fine, all of our languages are fine. And set up all of our users, it's going to be Bob. It's hard to screw up that. Choose a password. Again, a complex password would be nice. Encryption, I don't care. Yes, the time zone's fine. It's going to ask about our mounted partitions. Yeah, go ahead and unmount it. just tell it to use guided use the entire disk. Just use the whole thing. Hopefully you're not trying to partition your little USB drive. Yep, that's our 64 gig drive. Write these changes. Yes. So now it's going to wipe it and then install Ubuntu. The one thing I did forget is make sure during your software install, it'll ask if you want to install things like the mail server, Postgres, Samba, if you want to do file sharing, all that good stuff. Make sure you select the OpenSSH server. Otherwise, after it reboots, you're still not going to be able to connect to the thing. You'll still need a keyboard and have to fiddle your way through it blindly. So just make sure you have that option selected before you finish the install. I think we're going to go ahead and skip ahead since there's nothing different here than a regular system, and we'll go right to having it boot off of that little USB drive. Alright, so it says our installation's complete. It's time to boot into our new system. So we're going to say continue. Alright, so now it's closed. And then we should see, okay, so now our front panel's gone back to startup initializing. So we're going to push that button in one more time and then disconnect our boot USB drive, or our installer USB drive, and then hold the button on the front, or on the rear, you dumbass. And then what should happen is our little USB drive there, you should see it flash when it tries to boot. Loading recovery. And there we go. So there goes the bootloader. And now we can see it's booting up. So now we just wait for the little blinky light to finish. And then once it is, the system should be started and we should have SSH running. So we should be able to get in through a shell. Alright, it should be booted up, so let's bring up PuTTY, and then we'll connect to it with the same IP that we connected to it with it last time. 5181. And now we're going to log in with the user that we set up during the installer. It was Bob, good old Bob. And we're in. That's it. So from here you can treat it like any other Ubuntu install. If you want to put Samba, postfix, whatever you want on there, go to town. The only issue you're going to have is it won't automatically boot to this if you turn it off and back on again. You have to hold that little reset button every time to get it to boot off of here. So what you can do is either somehow wedge that button or solder across the little points on the button so that it's basically always being held in. And that will force it to boot off the USB drive every time. So here's our PuTTY session. Let's check what the CPU info shows. We see we have our genuine Intel Atom D525 at 1 point, and it's running at 1.8 gigahertz, and blah blah blah, regular old CPU info. I don't know if the camera picks it up very well or not, but it still says initializing loading recovery once the install is done and you boot off the actual the complete install. I don't know how to change this. This is beyond my capability. Somebody smarter than me can probably figure out how to interface with it with a Linux driver of some sort, or serial, or whatever it uses. I'm not worried about it. This is just a proof of concept. But if somebody out there wants to take that challenge on or tell me how they think I can do it, I'm open to suggestions. So from here you can just treat it like any other Ubuntu install. Install Samba, Apache, do what you want. The drives do work on the SATA controller, so if you want to create a bunch of storage, share it out with Samba or FTP or whatever, you sure can do it. You also have two USB 3 ports on the back. So if you don't want to use the hub, you can just plug it straight in. It still works that way. Otherwise, you can keep your hub plugged in and plug in more drives. It still works with webcams, keyboards, anything you want to hook up USB does still work with it. So anyway, that's the proof of concept. Everything's there, seems to be working. I hope you found this video enjoyable, informational. If you have any questions, comments, criticisms, please feel free to leave them in the little white space down below there so I can promptly ignore them.